military strategy, it's kind of like a giant game of chess, right?
Mm-hmm.
But instead of a board, it's played out across land, sea, and air.
Yeah.
Well, today we're adding another dimension to the game. Space.
Space, yeah.
To help us navigate through this complex world, we're going back to the classics.
Okay.
No, not Sun Tzu this time.
Right.
Another giant of military thought.
Who's that?
Karl von Clausewitz and his masterpiece on war.
Clausewitz. Now, he was writing back in the 19th century, right?
That's right, yeah.
But it's amazing how his ideas about strategy and conflict, even war itself,
Yeah.
are still surprisingly relevant today in the age of, satellites and cyber warfare.
It really is remarkable. It's like these ideas from centuries past can still speak to us today.
Mm-hmm.
So for our listeners out there,
Right.
especially those serving in the armed forces,
Mm-hmm.
we're diving deep on Clausewitz.
Okay.
Specifically, Chapter 3 of On War, which focuses on planning considerations.
Right.
Now, we're not military strategists yourselves, but we'll do our best to break down these concepts, hopefully in a way that's insightful and maybe even a little bit, entertaining.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Clausewitz, he really gets into the weeds in this chapter.
He does.
He emphasizes that effective planning, it's not just about, troop movements and maps.
Right.
It's about really understanding the relationship between your political objectives and your military means.
Yeah.
And, of course, the unpredictable nature of war itself.
Right. He was big on the whole fog of war concepts, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That idea that no plan survives contact with the enemy perfectly intact.
Exactly. Clausewitz recognized that, war is chaotic, it's unpredictable. You can't plan for every single thing that's going to happen.
Right.
But what you can do is create a framework.
Okay.
A framework that allows for flexibility, adaptation,
Right.
and most importantly, a clear understanding of what the desired end state is.
So it's less about trying to predict the future perfectly and more about creating a plan that can adapt,
Yes.
that can bend when things inevitably get messy.
Precisely. And one of the things that he talks about in this chapter that's really interesting is what he calls centers of gravity.
Centers of gravity. Okay.
He argued that every conflict has these kind of pivotal points,
Okay.
whether they're physical locations, key leaders, sometimes even morale itself.
Okay.
These are points that are essential to the enemy's ability to wage war.
So like identifying and then exploiting those centers of gravity
Yeah, absolutely.
becomes essential to winning.
Absolutely. If
Yeah.
you can find the enemy center of gravity
Yeah.
and you can strike at it effectively,
Yeah.
you can really cripple their ability to fight.
It's like finding that weak link in your opponent's armor.
Exactly. Exactly. And, he stresses that these centers of gravity, they can shift.
Right. Okay.
So what might be super critical at the beginning of the conflict might become less important as things change.
So you're constantly having to reevaluate.
Exactly. It's a very dynamic battlefield.
Okay.
You constantly have to be reassessing, adapting.
It's a very dynamic approach, isn't it? You're constantly reevaluating, readjusting based on the ever-changing realities on the ground as they develop.
Absolutely. You have to be able to think on your feet.
Right.
You have to be able to adjust your plan as the situation changes.
But how do you translate that to modern warfare?
Right.
Because now the battlefield's expanded.
Yeah.
You've got space, you've got cyberspace.
It's a good question, yeah. Because when Clausewitz was writing, obviously, he
Yeah.
couldn't have imagined the kind of warfare that we're seeing today, right?
Right.
With satellites and cyber attacks and all that.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, his core principles,
Yeah.
they still hold true.
Okay.
So let's take the concept of centers of gravity, for example.
Okay, yeah.
How do you apply that to something like space?
Right.
Which has become so vital to how militaries operate today.
Right. Okay, so how would you apply that concept then to space?
Well, let's think about the role that satellites play today, right?
Yeah.
They provide communication, navigation, intelligence,
Right.
all sorts of vital functions.
Yeah.
If you could disrupt, let's say destroy,
Yeah.
those capabilities,
Yeah.
you could really cripple an enemy's ability to fight a war.
So they become centers of gravity in themselves.
In a way, they do, yeah.
Right.
They become these critical points
Yeah.
that if you can neutralize them,
Right.
you can have a major impact on the course of a conflict.
It would have a ripple effect, wouldn't it? Across the entire battlefield.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you see the same thing in cyberspace, right?
Right.
If you can disrupt communication networks, financial systems,
Yeah.
critical infrastructure,
Right.
you can really cripple a modern military
Right.
or any modern state for that matter.
Wow. It's like Clausewitz's ideas, they're like a Swiss Army knife, aren't they?
Right.
For understanding the complexities of conflict. No matter what the time period, no matter what the tech is.
The principles still hold.
Yeah. So for our listeners, especially those in the military, grappling with the challenges of modern warfare.
Sure.
What's the key takeaway from this chapter?
I think the key takeaway is you've got to be adaptable.
Right.
You have to be able to think critically.
Yeah.
Because war is a dynamic, unpredictable beast.
Right.
And you have to be ready for anything.
No plan survives first contact.
Right.
Exactly.
So how do you put that into practice, though?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Because Clausewitz, he talks a lot about the importance of understanding your own strengths and weaknesses,
okay,
as well as your enemies.
So you have to be honest with yourself about what you're good at, what you're not good at.
Absolutely.
And be able to accurately assess your opponent as well.
You have to understand who you're up against.
Right.
You have to understand their capabilities, their limitations.
It's not just about having a brilliant plan, is it? No.
You also have to understand how that plan might play out against a thinking opponent.
Exactly. Exactly. Clausewitz, he really stresses this idea of thinking several moves ahead.
Right.
Anticipating your enemy's actions.
Right.
Being prepared to exploit their mistakes.
Okay.
While at the same time minimizing your own.
It is like a high-stakes game of chess, isn't it?
It really is.
But the stakes are, well,
a little bit higher.
Life and death.
Exactly. And just like in chess, knowledge is power.
Right.
So Clausewitz, he talks a lot about intelligence gathering,
Okay.
reconnaissance,
Yeah.
understanding the terrain where the conflict is taking place.
And that terrain now includes space and cyberspace.
That's right. And that just adds a whole other layer of complexity to it.
Right.
But the point is,
Yeah.
you need to know what you're getting into.
Right.
You need to understand the battlefield
Right.
if you want to have any chance of success.
Makes sense.
And that's why Clausewitz is still relevant, because he forces us to think critically about what war is,
Okay.
to recognize that it is inherently uncertain,
Yeah.
and to approach planning
Yeah.
not as a one-time thing,
Right.
but as a dynamic, evolving process.
It's about being able to adjust,
Absolutely.
be resourceful,
Right.
and always be thinking, like you said, a couple of steps ahead.
Exactly. Always trying to anticipate what your opponent might do next.
Okay. Now, there's another thing I wanted to ask you about this chapter.
Okay, yeah.
He talks about this concept of friction in warfare.
Friction. Right.
What exactly does he mean by that?
It's basically the idea that even the best laid plans,
Yeah.
they're going to encounter problems.
Right.
There are going to be delays.
Yeah.
Things are not going to go perfectly according to plan.
Right.
And you have to be prepared for that.
So it's not just about outsmarting the enemy on the battlefield.
Yeah.
It's also about overcoming all of these logistical and unforeseen challenges
Exactly.
that inevitably pop up.
Right. Think about it this way.
Okay.
You're trying to coordinate
Yeah.
large-scale operations,
Yeah.
often over vast distances
Right.
and in difficult conditions.
Yeah.
Things are going to go wrong.
Right.
It's just inevitable.
It's like trying to build a house of cards in a hurricane or something.
Exactly.
Any little gust of wind could come along and just blow everything apart.
The slightest miscalculation, the smallest unexpected event,
Right.
it can completely derail your plans.
And this friction, as he calls it, it's just inherent to war, right?
It is. It's something that every military commander throughout history has had to deal with.
Right.
And it's something that will always be a factor in warfare.
So how do you plan for that, though?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
How do you plan for the unpredictable?
Right.
Well, I think that's where experience comes into play.
Right.
It's also where intuition, deep understanding of your own limitations,
Right.
all of that comes into play.
It's that gut feeling that you develop over time.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he talks about this.
Okay.
He called it coup-o, I think is how you pronounce it.
Okay.
It's this ability to just assess a situation quickly
Right.
and make a judgment call, even when you're under pressure.
Right.
And that comes from experience. It comes from seeing a lot of different situations.
Right. It's trusting your gut, but it's an informed gut.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's not just like shooting from the hip.
Right.
It's based on years and years of observation and study.
Exactly. And I think it's that combination, right, of intellect and intuition
Yeah.
that really separates the great military minds from just the average ones.
Right, right.
It's being able to analyze the situation rationally,
Right.
but also trust your instincts when the time comes.
And that's as relevant today as it ever was.
Oh, absolutely.
Even with all of our technology.
Maybe even more so.
Right.
Because the pace of warfare is so much faster now.
Right.
You don't always have time.
Right. To sit back and do a detailed analysis.
You have to be able to think on your feet.
Exactly. You have to be able to make decisions quickly.
And communicate them clearly.
Yes. Communication, so important.
Because what good is a brilliant plan if nobody understands it, right?
Exactly. Clausewitz, he talks about this as well.
Okay.
He says that even the most brilliant plan is useless.
Right.
If you can't get the people who are actually executing it to understand it.
Right. To get on the same page.
Exactly. And that's especially important.
Right.
When you're talking about coordinating operations across vast distances.
Right.
Multiple domains like we see in modern warfare.
Right. You've got air, sea, land, space, cyber, all working together.
Exactly. One breakdown in communication.
Right.
And it can all fall apart.
It can be disastrous. Absolutely.
And it's not just about the orders themselves,
Okay.
It's about making sure that everyone understands the big picture.
Right.
The why.
The why. Why are we doing this? Exactly.
If everyone understands the why, they're much more likely to be able to adapt when those inevitable problems pop up.
Absolutely. Because they're not just blindly following orders.
Right.
They understand the intent.
Right.
They can use their own judgment to make decisions when they need to.
And that requires good leadership.
Absolutely. At all levels.
Yeah.
From the very top all the way down to the people on the front lines.
Because ultimately, war is a human endeavor, isn't it?
It is.
It's about people. It's not about machines.
It's about leadership.
Right.
It's about morale.
Right.
It's about the will to fight.
And all of those intangible human elements factor into how you plan.
Absolutely. And Clausewitz, he understood this.
Yeah.
He knew that you couldn't just focus on the military aspects of war.
Right.
You had to understand the human element as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And speaking of the human element, he also dedicates quite a bit of this chapter to the psychological dimensions of war, doesn't he?
Well, he does, yeah.
Like morale.
Morale is huge.
Right.
He talks about the importance of morale, both for your own troops and for the enemy.
Right. Because even if you have the most technologically advanced military in the world, if your soldiers don't have the will to fight, you've already lost, haven't you?
You pretty much lost the war before it's even begun.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, it's the soldiers on the ground who are actually doing the fighting and the dying.
And on the flip side, if you have an army with incredibly high morale, even if they're outmatched in terms of technology, they can still achieve incredible things.
Oh, absolutely. History is full of examples of that.
Right. So it goes both ways.
It really does.
It's that old saying, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog.
Exactly. And Clausewitz would agree with that. He understood that the human element, that intangible factor of will and determination, that can often be the deciding factor in war.
It really can. And maintaining that morale, especially when things are going badly.
Yes, especially then.
That's a huge part of leadership.
Huge part of leadership and planning. It's about instilling a sense of purpose in your soldiers.
Right.
It's about making them believe in the cause they're fighting for.
And that's a challenge that leaders have faced since the dawn of time.
Absolutely. It's a timeless challenge. And it's one that's not going away anytime soon.
Right. So even though Clausewitz was writing centuries ago, his insights into the human dimension of warfare, the importance of morale, the need for strong, decisive leadership, they're as relevant today as ever.
I would say even more so.
Because warfare is more complex than it's ever been.
It is. It's more technological.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it still comes down to people.
Right.
It comes down to the choices that they make.
And that human element is something that Clausewitz really understood.
He did. And that's why his work is still so valuable today.
It's incredible. A book written in the early 19th century.
I know it.
And it still has so much to teach us about modern conflict.
It's amazing. And you know what? It makes you wonder.
What is that?
As technology continues to advance,
Yeah.
Will Clausewitz's ideas still be relevant?
Right.
Or will they eventually become obsolete?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Me neither. But it's something to think about.
It is. It is.
It really is amazing. You know, it makes you think about how some ideas
Yeah.
They just stand the test of time.
They really do.
And Clausewitz's ideas, they definitely fall into that category.
They do, they do. So we left off talking about friction, right?
We did. That concept that Clausewitz talked about.
Yeah.
The idea that in war, nothing ever goes according to plan.
Right, there's always going to be something.
Always.
Some unexpected challenge or delay that pops up.
And the thing is, it's not just about, external factors like the weather or the terrain or what the enemy is doing.
Right.
Clausewitz also talks about what he calls internal friction.
Internal friction. Okay, so that's like what? Problems within your own ranks.
Exactly. It could be things like logistical problems, communication breakdowns, misunderstandings between commanders.
Right.
Even just the fact that, armies are made up of human beings, and human beings make mistakes.
Right. You can have the best soldiers in the world, the best equipment, but if the supply lines get messed up or people aren't communicating properly.
Exactly. Can all fall apart very quickly. So Clausewitz is basically saying that you have to be prepared for these internal challenges just as much as you have to be prepared for the external ones.
So it's not just about having a great plan. It's about having the flexibility and the resilience to adapt when that plan inevitably goes awry.
That's it. You've got to be able to think on your feet, make quick decisions, and adjust your strategy as the situation changes.
It's like that old saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's often lost, in how we tend to think about war. We tend to focus on these big, sweeping movements, these grand strategies.
Right.
But the reality is, war is chaotic. It's unpredictable. And the side that can best adapt to that chaos, the side that can roll with the punches, so to speak, is usually the side that comes out on top.
It's about being adaptable, resourceful, and always thinking a few steps ahead. So speaking of strategy, there's another really important point that Clausewitz makes in this chapter. He argues that war is inherently a political act.
Absolutely. That's a key point.
It's not just about, military victories on the battlefield. It's about achieving specific political goals.
Right. And in this chapter, Clausewitz really hammers that point home. He's saying that military leaders, they always have to keep those political objectives in mind when they're planning a campaign.
So it's not enough to just conquer territory or defeat the enemy's army. You have to do it in a way that actually advances your political goals.
Exactly. Every battle, every campaign, it all has to be in service of some larger political aim. And if it's not, then you're basically just wasting lives and resources.
Because you could win a battle, but if you lose sight of the bigger political picture, you might end up losing the war.
Right. Exactly. Or worse, you could win the war, but create even bigger problems for yourself down the line.
Right. Because war has consequences. It's not a game.
Exactly. And those consequences, they can last for generations.
And Clausewitz, he understood that, didn't he?
He did. And he provides some really good historical examples to illustrate this point.
Okay, like what?
Well, one example he uses is Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812.
Ah, yes, Napoleon's disastrous campaign in Russia. A classic case of overreach, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. Napoleon, he had this brilliant military mind, but he let his ambition get the better of him. He invaded Russia with this massive army, but he completely underestimated the challenges of fighting in such a vast and unforgiving environment.
And of course, the Russian winter didn't help matters either.
No, it did not. But the point is, Napoleon's campaign ultimately failed because he lost sight of the political realities.
Right. He might have won some battles early on, but he couldn't win the peace, so to speak.
Exactly. And Clausewitz uses this example to show how important it is for military leaders to understand the political context in which they're operating.
It's not enough to just be a great general. You have to be a bit of a diplomat and a statesman as well, right? You have to understand the nuances of international relations and how your actions on the battlefield are going to be perceived by other nations.
Absolutely. And I think that's even more true today than it was in Clausewitz's time.
Right, because we live in a much more interconnected world.
Exactly. So when you're planning a military operation today, you can't just think about the immediate tactical objectives. You have to think about the long-term strategic implications. You have to think about how your actions are going to play out on the global stage.
Because the whole world is watching.
They are, and they're judging. And those judgments, they can have a real impact on your ability to achieve your objectives.
So how do we connect this idea of war as a political act with, modern warfare, where we're seeing things like space becoming increasingly important?
That's a great question, and it's something that I think a lot of people are grappling with right now. Because space, it's this new domain of warfare, and we're still trying to figure out what the rules are, what the norms of behavior should be.
Right, it's like the Wild West out there.
In a lot of ways it is, but the same principles apply. Just because you're fighting in space doesn't mean you can ignore the political realities.
So, for example, if you're thinking about using your space assets to, say, take out an enemy satellite, you have to think about, well, what kind of message does that send to the rest of the world?
Exactly. Is it worth the risk of escalating the conflict? Could it damage your relationships with other countries? These are all things that military leaders have to consider.
It's about being strategic in the broadest sense, isn't it?
It is. It's about thinking about the second-order effects, the unintended consequences. And it's about understanding that in war, just like in any other aspect of international relations, perception matters.
Absolutely. Perception matters.
Yeah.
Now, there's another thing I wanted to ask you about Clausewitz's ideas.
Okay.
He seems to place a lot of emphasis on the importance of offensive action in warfare.
He does. He does. Clausewitz was definitely a believer in the power of the offensive. He argued that the side that dictates the terms of the conflict, this side that's constantly pushing forward, that side has the advantage.
So it's not enough to just defend your own territory. You have to be willing to take the fight to the enemy.
Exactly. Clausewitz believed that a purely defensive posture, while it might be necessary sometimes, it's ultimately a losing strategy.
Interesting. So why is that?
Well, for one thing, when you're on the defensive, you're basically reacting to your enemy's moves. You're letting them dictate the pace and direction of the conflict.
Right, you're always a step behind.
Exactly. Whereas when you're on the offensive, you have the initiative. You're the one calling the shots.
So it's about being proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. And Clausewitz argued that this was essential for achieving decisive victory in war. Now, he wasn't advocating for reckless aggression. He understood that you have to pick your battles carefully.
Right, right. It's not about attacking just for the sake of attacking.
Exactly. But he did believe that whenever possible, you should be looking for opportunities to seize the initiative and take the fight to the enemy.
Now, how do you apply that to the modern battlefield? Especially when we're talking about something like space, where it can be hard to distinguish between offensive and defensive actions.
That's a really interesting question, and it's something that military strategists are still trying to figure out. But I think the underlying principle still holds true. Even in space, the side that can control the narrative, so to speak, the side that can dictate the terms of engagement, that side is going to have a significant advantage.
It's about keeping your opponent off balance, isn't it?
Exactly. It's about being unpredictable, keeping them guessing. And it's about being willing to take calculated risks.
And how does this emphasis on the offensive tie back to Clausewitz's concept of centers of gravity, those critical points that can make or break a military campaign?
Ah, that's a great connection. Because Clausewitz believed that offensive action is often the best way to target and exploit an enemy's centers of gravity.
So by striking at those critical vulnerabilities, you can disrupt their ability to wage war effectively.
Exactly. You can throw them off balance, disrupt their plans, and potentially bring the conflict to a quicker resolution.
It's like you're going for the knockout punch, but you're doing it in a strategic way, targeting those areas where the enemy is most vulnerable.
Precisely. You're not just throwing punches randomly hoping that something lands. You're carefully analyzing your opponent, identifying their weaknesses, and then striking at those weaknesses with precision and purpose.
This was like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, not a butcher with a cleaver.
Exactly. And that's what Clausewitz is getting at, I think, with this emphasis on the offensive. It's not about mindless aggression. It's about using your military power in a targeted and effective way to achieve your political objectives.
Okay, so it's about being strategic, about thinking several moves ahead, about understanding the bigger picture, but it's also about being decisive, about seizing the initiative when the opportunity arises.
Exactly. And that balance, that ability to be both strategic and decisive, that's what separates the great military leaders from the average ones.
And that's a skill that's as relevant today as it was in Clausewitz's time.
Absolutely. Because even though the weapons we use have changed, the nature of war at its core, it hasn't really changed that much.
It's still about outmaneuvering your opponent, about exploiting their weaknesses, about imposing your will on them. And sometimes the best way to do that is to take the fight to them.
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he understood that. But, he also understood that there are times when a defensive posture is necessary. It's not always about attacking, right?
Right, right. So when is it best to hold back and defend?
Well, sometimes you might need to buy time, you know? Maybe regroup your forces, maybe let the enemy make a mistake.
Okay, so sometimes it's better to be patient, to wait for the right opportunity to strike?
Exactly. And Clausewitz, he actually talks about this idea of culminating point of the offensive, which is basically the idea that every attack, it eventually loses momentum.
Okay.
And at that point, if you haven't achieved your objectives, you're actually in a very vulnerable position.
Interesting. So you're almost better off switching to the defensive at that point.
Exactly. And this is where that adaptability that we talked about earlier comes into play, because the best military leaders, they're not married to one approach or the other. They understand when to attack and they understand when to defend, and they can seamlessly transition between the two as the situation demands.
So it's about being flexible, being adaptable, being able to adjust your strategy on the fly.
Exactly. And that's not easy to do, especially in the heat of battle. But it's essential if you want to be successful in war.
Because as Clausewitz reminds us, war is a dynamic and unpredictable beast. And the side that can best adapt to those changing circumstances is usually the side that comes out on top. It really is remarkable how, even in our modern context, Clausewitz's ideas are still relevant. But before we wrap up, let's circle back to Chapter 3.
Okay.
See if there are any other golden nuggets of wisdom we can extract. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
But I feel like there's always more to unpack with Clausewitz.
Absolutely. One thing that really jumps out at me in this chapter is how much he emphasizes what he calls moral factors in warfare.
Moral factors.
How?
Okay, so we're not just talking about, like, tanks and planes and missiles.
Yeah.
We're talking about those intangible elements.
Exactly. Morale, national will, the strength of leadership.
The human side of war.
Exactly. Clausewitz, he understood that war is as much a psychological struggle as it is a physical one.
Right.
And that these moral factors, they can often be the deciding factor in a conflict.
So a smaller, less technologically advanced force, if they have that willpower,
yes,
if they have strong leadership, they can potentially overcome a more powerful adversary.
Absolutely. It's like that old saying, right?
What's that?
It's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog.
I've heard that one.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think Clausewitz would totally agree with that sentiment. He'd say, look, you can have all the weapons in the world.
Yep.
But if your soldiers don't believe in what they're fighting for, if they don't have that will to win, you're not going to be successful.
It's not just about having the sharpest spears.
Right.
It's about having the will to use those spears effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
And the resilience, right, to kind of weather the storm.
Yeah.
Because war is never easy.
Never. And Clausewitz, he understood that.
Yeah.
He gives some really interesting historical examples to back this up.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, he talks about the American Revolution, for example.
Ah, okay.
You've got these American colonists, right?
Right.
Going up against the mighty British Empire.
And they were outmatched, weren't they? In terms of like technology and resources.
Oh, absolutely. Completely outmatched.
Sure.
But they had something else.
What's that?
They had this unwavering belief in what they were fighting for.
Right. Their independence.
Exactly. And that made a huge difference.
It's amazing to think about that this ragtag group of colonists facing off against,
I know,
one of the most powerful empires in the world at the time, and they won.
And they won because they had that spirit,
Right.
that determination. And they were willing to fight, and they were willing to die for what they believed in. And that, to me, that's a really, really powerful lesson.
It is. It's a good reminder that, firepower and technology, those are important.
Yeah.
But they're not the only factors that determine the outcome of a war.
They're not.
It's about the human element. It's about courage, determination,
Absolutely.
the will to fight for something greater than yourself.
And Clausewitz, he understood this.
And he argued that it was the leader's responsibility to cultivate those things.
Absolutely. He said that fostering these moral factors, high morale, strong leadership, it's essential.
Wow.
Because if you can get those things right, if you can get your soldiers to believe in what they're fighting for, then you're well on your way to winning the war.
Right, because at the end of the day, wars are won by people.
Exactly.
Not by machines, not by technology.
People. And that's something that I think sometimes gets lost, especially in this day and age.
Right, we have all this advanced technology, drones, cyber warfare.
Exactly. We tend to focus on the hardware.
The hardware.
But we can't forget about the software.
A software which is what? The human element.
Exactly. The human element, the will to fight, the courage, the leadership. These things still matter, maybe now more than ever.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into Chapter 3 of On War, What's I guess, the key takeaway for our listeners, especially those out there who are currently serving in the military or maybe thinking about a career in uniform?
I think the biggest takeaway is that war is incredibly complex. It's not a video game. It's not a movie. It's messy, it's unpredictable, and honestly, it can be downright tragic.
Yeah.
And to succeed in that kind of environment, you need more than just, technical skills or tactical knowledge.
You need to be a student of history, right?
Yes.
Understand how past conflicts have played out.
Learn from the mistakes of those who came before you.
Right, and be able to adapt those lessons to the modern battlefield.
Because the battlefields might change, but human nature, that doesn't change.
That's a good point. So to our listeners out there, whether you're, a seasoned commander or you're just starting out your military journey, remember that the study of war is an ongoing process.
It is.
It's a lifelong pursuit, really.
Yeah.
Keep reading, keep learning, keep asking questions, and never, never stop trying to improve your understanding of this complex and, let's be honest, pretty dark subject.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought-provoking question. As technology continues to advance at this incredible pace, will Clausewitz's ideas stand the test of time? Or will they eventually become as outdated as the muskets and cannons of his era?
Ooh, good question. We'd love to hear what you think. So feel free to share your thoughts with us on social media. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, stay curious.